All right, we're live in YouTube now.
Nice.
So awesome. So hello everyone. I can see already that we have some people joining, and that's awesome. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining another Musiversal live stream. This time we're gonna talk about mastering with the one and only Luiz Tornaghi. Luiz, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing now?
My pleasure. Doing very well. Thank you. Great to be
Awesome.
here.
Oh, we're very, very happy to see you here. And for you guys that already have been into our live streams, you know that we're going to show some music, and we do run the risk, unfortunately, of having this live taken down because of it. But if you go to the comment section here on YouTube, you're going to be able to look at a link that's actually our backup live stream. So if you want, if for any reason our live stream is taken down, you can just click that link, and then you can watch our live stream in another platform, which won't be taken down. So if you haven't joined Musiversal Unlimited yet, our window is currently closed, but it's going to open very, very soon. And you definitely want to take advantage of that because it will close soon again, and then you have to wait more time to join Musiversal Unlimited. And tonight we do have a mastering engineer that is available in Musiversal Unlimited, and you definitely want to listen to this and take advantage of his skills when it comes to mastering music. We're gonna take a very easy approach tonight. We're gonna talk about very simple stuff, and we also are going to talk about a little bit more complex. We are going to listen to some examples of music later on tonight. And if you are already a Musiversal user, you do know that we don't usually stream audio using normal platforms like Zoom or YouTube. We usually use audio movers, which allow us to listen to music remotely in a much better quality. And we will share the link for audio movers later, and you can listen through that. But if you don't want to join audio movers and listen over there, you can still listen here on YouTube, and it's still going to be good quality. But of course, audio movers is always better. So without further ado, let's talk about mastering with Luiz. Luiz, I want to start with a very simple question before we start to look into music. I want to ask you, what is mastering and how is different from mixing? Because I always hear mixing and mastering, and I know that those are two separate things. So what is mastering and how is it different from mixing?
When you're mixing, you have individual control of every single instrument, right? So if you have a bass, kick, snare, hi-hat, vocals, every single instrument, you have absolute control, and you can choose to levels, EQs, whatever of each one of those. When you're mastering, you take the final mix and you make it ready for distribution, right? So there are lots of ways of defining mastering. One of the ways I joke about is mastering is putting out there what the mixing engineer thought he had done in the studio, right? Which is not really true. But it's this idea that when you're mixing, you're focusing on a lot of things. You're focusing on, how loud should my vocals be? What's the sound of the bass? How, am I going to use an amp simulator or not? Am I going to actually run it through an amp? If I have more than one microphone on an instrument, which combination of microphones am I going to use? Whatever. And you're mixing the same song for hours. There's no way. It's just the biology. After a while, you get used to that low end, you get used to that mid-range, and it's very hard to keep perspective. When you're in the mastering room, you're always putting up your references and jumping to your song and listening to it and making sure there's, the low end is where you want, the mid-range is where you want, the size of the sound is where you want, and you're focusing on having your song sounding as good as it can, no matter where it's playing.
That's really, really interesting. Well, when it comes to, when you said that it's putting out, doing what the mixing engineer thought he did when he was mixing the song, this is something that it always captures my attention because when you have individual control of everything and you're mixing, you're trying to make everything sound the best it can by itself, and then to make it sound the best it can with the other instruments, right? So after you have that working, when you go to mastering, is that fixing issues that come up in the mixing, or is that doing something different? Because you have less control in mastering. You don't have the actual, separate tracks to work in. So how do you actually do that?
Yeah. Fixing is a complicated work. It's mastering is, there's a role for mastering no matter how good your mix is, right? Of course, depending on your mix, there might be a larger or smaller difference between the before and after mastering. But there are two different things. One thing is how good is your mix, and another thing is how different from the final master your mix is, right? So I know some mixing engineers that I love their work, right? And that, but that every time I receive them, I have to change a lot of stuff before it's ready. And the difference is humongous between what you listen to before and after the master, right? And there are other engineers that, might not be necessarily the best mixing engineers in the world, that the music is not the most appealing, under many aspects, but that I pick them up and I go like, okay, I'm going to, do a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and it's ready. And you don't really notice that much difference between before and after mastering. So they're really two different. When you're mixing, when you're mastering, you're focusing on different things, right? Of course, both of them are trying to make the music as appealing as and emotional as you can, but through different tools, right? Yeah. Was that an answer?
Oh, yeah, that was a very, very complete answer. And that makes a lot of sense because I think it also depends on the genre, right? How much does mastering, how much does the genre of the music affects the mastering process? Or is it like pretty much the same for everything?
Yeah, well, it affects in the sense that depending on the genre of music, you're looking for a different, the genre of the music. If all of this is about having the music, being emotional, right? It's all about accentuating the emotional appeal of the music. Yeah, when you're talking about a mastering, there's also this more technical aspect of making it work in everywhere, right? But even then, it's making it emotionally appealing everywhere, right? So in that sense, of course, if I'm mastering rock and roll, the kind of tools and the way I'm going to approach it is very different than if I'm mastering a jazz ballad. But that said, it's the process is very, very similar. There's no big for some time in music, I have to work more or I have to do different things. I have to do different things in the sense that, okay, mastering is a lot about texture, right? So if I'm going for a more rock and roll vibe, then I'm going to be using some tools that will accentuate the harmonics and accentuate that aggressiveness, and it will, have that power going on, right? And if I'm mastering a string quartet, right, chances are I will use very different tools, and it's all about being smooth and being open and so the tools you're using are different, but it's not that different a process in terms of, okay, I listen to this, I'm thinking, what is the song asking me to do, right? And from there, I start to choose which tools are the best to get where I want, and you start molding the sound till you get, till you're happy with what you're hearing.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. We already have a couple of technical questions coming up, but before we delve into the technical part, and we will talk about how to send files to you to master and how do you like to receive your files, I wanted to just get a little bit. I'm curious about one thing. I remember when I was studying music, they were talking. The mastering process came when we would cut a vinyl or cut a record, and we needed the songs to work with each other. So they had to be the same volume. They had to be as loud as the other one. They had to essentially work together and feel like they are part of the same thing because they were part of the same record. But now records, while they still exist and I absolutely love them, they are not the way that people usually listen to music. It's a little bit different. People listening to playlists that have a bunch of music for different albums or different artists together, or we have artists releasing more singles than actual records. So why is mastering important if the song doesn't have the album to work? I mean, they do have the album sometimes, but it's not the same thing as back in the day where we had the album together. Like the music doesn't necessarily have to work with the songs around them because they're being released as a single and not as an album. So how is that working, and how is mastering affecting that?
Yeah. Again, one thing that my copy paste speeches here about different definitions of mastering, different approaches of mastering, right? The main thing in mastering is no matter what you were listening to before, when your song comes in, it has to come in beautiful, right? And you're absolutely right. Back in the day, when this was also about coherence within one album. So the difference is that if you're thinking, no matter what I was listening to before, my song has to come in beautiful. Back in the day, I knew what I was listening to before. I was listening to the previous song in the album, right? And today, that's not true anymore. And there's an added complexity to that, which is that the streaming platforms will set the volume for you 90% of the time, right? So you can turn off the volume normalization, but most people don't. Most people don't even know it can be done. So that becomes an issue, because if you're talking about how loud it is, how loud it is, you don't have absolute control over that, right? And actually, different streaming platforms will use different algorithms to define the volume and whatnot. And if you have a computer putting two songs at the same volume, good luck putting, Frank Sinatra and Nirvana at the same volume. How do you do that? Right?
It would definitely sound interesting, I would say. So yeah, this is really. Does it make it harder to master today? Because back in the day, you knew what you said. You knew what song was coming before. Now you don't. Does that make the mastering process more challenging, or it doesn't really make a difference?
Larger extent isn't really the fact that you have that you don't know what's coming before. The largest challenge is that you don't know how the volume normalization is going to work, and so it is a relief in some sense, because forget vinyl. Vinyl is a whole different story. But if you're talking about CDs, you really needed your music to be as loud as you could, right? So within reason, that you didn't, screw up with overcompression. You wanted your song to be loud, right? If something else is playing and your song comes in and it's sounding low means it's sounding with less low and it's sounding with less high end, because that's just how our ears work. These days, if the streaming platforms are setting the volume for you, and I make my sound really, really loud, my master is not going to sound necessarily louder at the end of the day. It's just going to sound more compressed, right? So that adds a level of difficulty, because you have, in one hand, you have more freedom. Okay, I have a good excuse not to make an overcompressed sound, right? And on the other hand, you have less control over the relationship in volume between what you are doing and what, and the song that's coming beforehand, right? Depending on how things are set.
That makes a lot of sense. We have a question from one of our listeners. Brian just asked, if you are working with a master engineer and you're going to send files to this master engineer, how many dBs do you want as a headroom to play with? So how loud does my mix have to be so that I can send that to the engineer and the master engineer would have room to work with, but at the same time, my mix can sound as loud as I want to be? Like, is there a rule of thumb for that, or it depends?
Sure. Of course, any answer I give here, a different master engineer may give a different answer, right? But the rule of thumb, there are two different things here, right? One is the peak level, right? And the other is how much compression do you have in your mix already overall? Mainly the compressor in the mastering bus in the master track, if you're using compressor in the master track, right? So as far as peak goes, your peak should go to 0, right? Or minus 0.1, right? If you're at minus 2, minus 3, that's not a big deal. If you're at minus 12, that's not a good thing, right? Minus 6, there's no good reason to do that, right? So your peaks should be at minus 0.1 ideally, right? Up to minus 3, I still consider like, not important. When you start to get below minus 3, I start to go like, you're tossing away quality out the window for no good reason.
So I'm sorry to interrupt. So if my mix isn't loud enough, I am throwing quality away. So the quality is actually going to be lower.
So let's get into that, right? So let me share my screen here for a second.
Of course.
So we're getting really technical here, but hopefully this will be simple enough that people can relate to.
Right? And I think this is really important because if you're actually throwing away your resolution for sending stuff that is not loud enough, and does that, well, this is a follow-up question, I guess, but does that happen also when recording? Well, let's get into that, and you can explain to us later.
When you're recording, I'm going to give you a very quick answer for the recording part of that, right? When you're recording, what happens is you need the headroom because you don't want to clip, right? So you don't want to have a straight line. You don't want to distort your sound, right? And when you're recording, you want to give the musician freedom to go crazy, right? And play a lot louder than he did in the previous take, right? So you don't want the peak to be close to minus 0, right? Because you want to allow the musician to go crazy. So you allow, even though in principle the theory holds, either when you're recording too, you want to give yourself more headroom so that the musician can go bonkers and you're not clipping. If you're in a mixing situation, you have control over everything. So there's no real good reason not to have it, have a narrower margin there. Right.
That sounds great. So just before we get into the technical stuff, Brian, the ideal dB situation would be peak dB as close to minus 1, minus 0.1, minus 0 as possible. And below minus 3, that would start throwing away resolution. And now we're going to find out why.
Yeah. Just to complement what you just said, we're talking about peak. We can talk about RMS or LUFS or overall level too. That's a separate subject, right? Yes. So if you're talking about how loud should I send my mix, there are two aspects to this: the peak level and also the average level, right? But let's talk about the peak first, right?
Great.
So what you're seeing here on the screen is exactly the same waveform, right? The same audio. The top one is recorded at 16 bits and the bottom one in 24 bits. And just by looking at it, you can't really tell much of a difference, right? I mean, the two waveforms look pretty much the same, right? I'm going to zoom out here. You're going to notice that this is a relatively healthy volume we are here, right? Which means that we're close to the limit here, right?
Right.
On the vertical axis. The bit resolution is all about, the bit depth is all about the resolution on the vertical axis, right? So the sample rate is how many dots per second do I have here, right? And the bit depth has to do with how many steps do I have on the vertical axis. So what happens if I look at the waveform way down here when it was already very low, right? So let's say that back here I have a limited number of steps from down here to down here. I have 100 steps, whatever, right? So if I have 100 steps between here and here, between here and here, I have like 10 steps, 2 steps, 3 steps, right? A lot less steps than I do have over here. Does that make sense? Am I being clear here? Right?
Yes,
so if my scale here
sense.
goes from minus 100 to plus 100, on this part, I only have from minus 2 to plus 2 or something. So if I zoom in over here and I'm looking closer, now you can really see that the two waveforms look radically different. What's the difference here? Because here, everything was rounded up to the same number. And in the bottom one, when you had 24 bits, you could, you had more leeway here, more precision to specify exactly, the height that waveform should be, the height that the original waveform was, right? That's the idea of why you don't want your peak to be below -9 or something, right? Because you're not using the full resolution you have in the vertical axis, right? Instead of having two, if you're talking about 24 bits, right? You have 2 to the 24th power is the number of bits of steps you have in the vertical axis. If your peak is at -9, well, I'm sorry, you don't have 24 bits, you only have 23 bits there, right? Not a big deal, right? 23 bits is a very decent resolution, but there's also no good reason to do that, right? And the difference is audible, right? It's a subtle difference, but it is audible. Right.
And I mean, it might not be audible for most people when you just listen to it by itself. But after you send it to a mixing engineer or a mastering engineer, you're going to process it, and maybe the processing can. This is actually a question: can the processing make that quality difference more audible than it would be if it wasn't processed?
In the mastering, you kind of have a microscope on top of everything. So I'm not sure if you make it more audible. It's more about, of course, the better. I mean, I have, expensive speakers with a treated room. And so I have all the conditions here to notice details that, people, before you get to the mastering room, right? There are many man hours behind that song, right? A lot of money spent eventually to get that song right? So I get the song that guy spent $6,000 on a microphone for those vocals. He went, I can't afford to toss resolution out the window, right? There's too much at stake, right? And it's one thing that I get all the time is, oh, I'm doing everything here, and why don't I sound as good as, that artist I love? Well, part of that answer, of course, there's lots of things involved, but part of that answer is also attention to detail, right? So you will not see a major artist recording in 16 bits, right? You won't see a major artist, doing a lot of sample rate conversion back and forth depending on what's going on, right? You record at 96K 24 bits and it stays at 96K 24 bits throughout the production, right? The mastering engineers and myself particularly, I'm paid to pay attention to stuff that, is subtle But I really do believe that, those things add up. And in a lot of what you notice or you don't notice, I also believe has to do with your focus. So I've been in the situation in the studio many times where the client will send me 2 files, and I'll ask him about the difference, and they'll say no, or he'll send me 16-bit file and say, please send the 24-bit, and he sends it, and he didn't even stop to listen to it until I put them both over here and I played them back to back, and it said, listen to the 24-bit and listen to the 16-bit. And the client, which never thought about, what's up with that, he just pressed the bounce button, right? Suddenly goes like, oh my God, yeah, the symbols are completely trash in the 16-bit version after I listened to the 24-bit, right?
Yeah, it's a difference that it might be subtle at the beginning, but that's what you said. Things add up in the music production process, and they tend to get more audible. And even though I, as a music producer, I hear a lot of my clients saying, well, most people are going to listen to this in like a $5 headphone, and they won't notice that difference. But I think my answer usually for that is people might not logically and actually listen to that difference consciously, but they will feel the difference, and they will say, well, this song just doesn't sound right, or I don't like this song that much. What do you usually tell people when they say that, most people won't notice to that kind of detail?
Yeah, I think you do have to both things are true. I truly believe in what you just said, that there are a lot of things that you don't perceive rationally, but that do make an impact on how the person lives the music, how the person feels the music, right? But it's also true that, we're trying to do our best here, and our job is to get the best sound out there. But whenever a client sends me a 16-bit file, I don't turn to him and say, I'm sorry, I can't master your song. Please send me the 24-bit file. That makes no sense. I mean, let's work with the 16-bit file and we'll be fine. It's so, and there are lots involved in music, right? And certainly a 16 or 24-bit resolution is not the most important aspect by any far measure you can make about, what's going on.
Of course. That makes a lot of sense. Well, since you mentioned the client sending you files, let's talk a little bit about that, because this is a question that comes up a lot, especially with Musiversal users, because we want to know what kind of files do we have to send, not only you, but all of our musicians. Each one of the musicians have different preferences when it comes to files. I know, for example, Bruno Migliari, our bass player, he doesn't want to have a lot of tracks to work with. He wants a very simple, something that's very simple that he can just set up and maybe turn down the bass or the voice that he can do whatever he does. And he actually has a PDF that he sends people as to what kind of files does he like to receive when he's recording, that helps him creatively. And when we're talking about mixing, we need to send every single thing so that the mixing engineer can make every single track sound the best it can, so that he can put them together and make them sound good together. But when it comes to mastering, what kind of files are you expecting? Because while you are being very microscopic in your process and you are focusing on very tiny details, you don't want to receive every single track to master a song. That's not how mastering works, right? So what type of files are you expecting as a mastering engineer?
Sure. We skipped the average level, right? But we'll get back to that later on.
Yeah, we have to get back to that later, yes.
Yeah. Stereo music, a stereo WAV file, right? And that's it. So if you're talking about the resolution, you can send me a WAV file or an AIF file. That doesn't matter either way. Never change the sample rate, right? So whatever sample rate was used during the recording is the one that should be used during the mixing, is the one that should be used for the mastering. So if your workstation is at 48, send me a 48K file. If your workstation at 44, send me a 44.1 file. Whatever you're using on your DAW is you shouldn't change that when you're exporting, when you're generating the final stereo file. And with the maximum bit resolution that you can, right? So if your DAW exports 24 bits, that's fine. If your DAW exports 32 or 64 bits, great, right? 64 bits sounds a lot better than 24. 32 bits, the difference in sound quality between 24 bits and 32 bits is, personally, I feel that's, 32 bits is better, but there's more difference in texture than actually in quality. Because when you get to, not to be too technical here, when you get to 32 or 64 bit, you're talking about a floating point file, which is something totally different. But yeah, the short answer is the maximum number. Never change your sample rate and the maximum bit depth that you have available, right? And if you're getting this from a mixing engineer, so you're not the mixing engineer, you're the artist or the producer, and you're getting your files from the mixing engineer, then send to the mastering engineer exactly what the mixing engineer sent you, right? So if you sent everything zipped, you can send that zip file, even if that has like a version that's not the final version, I don't care, right? Send me the same zip package that you received from the mixing engineer and just tell me which one is the good one, right? But don't download it, save it in your computer, upload it again. There's no need for that. If you already have a zip file, that's, I want to get exactly what came from the mixing engineer, right?
Sounds great. And on that, when you book a mastering session in Musiversal, you have different options. You have stereo mastering and you have stem mastering. When should I send you my stems, and why would I need stem mastering and not stereo mastering?
Yeah. Most of the time, not always, I prefer the result using the stereo mix than using the stems. So what is stem mastering, right? So it's this idea that I will receive 3 or 4 stems, right? Normally drums, vocals, and either everything else or everything else except the bass and the bass separately, right? So stem mastering is about working with 3 or 4 stems. Of course, there are exceptions. There are some cases where the person wants to send a 5th stem for some specific reason. I normally don't recommend that. When you start to get more stems, then it starts to become mixing, right? What's the advantage to that? Well, I'm going to use compression. I'm going to use a limiter, right? So when the kick and snare hit, right, assuming you have a kick and snare in your mix, right, or when the percussion hits, if I'm working in stereo, my limiter will lower everything every time the snare hits, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But if I have a separate track just for the drums, then I can hold back only the drums without affecting everything else. So it's a much more powerful tool. It takes at least twice at the time, right? You can mold the sound with a lot more flexibility, right? And you can actually change things like, raise just the vocals in the beginning if you want, or things like that, right? Why do I not like it most of the time, right? So it's more powerful, you have more flexibility, you can do more with it, so why don't you like it? Well, it's pretty straightforward. The stereo file is the mix that the mixing engineer did. So he was sitting in front of his speakers, and what was coming out of his speakers is what's registered on that stereo file. So he decided he wanted to hear that, and that's the raw material I'm starting with. It's something that someone said, this is cool, I like this. When you have stems, you have a group of 4 tracks that, when added together, never sound exactly like the stereo mix, right? Regardless of if the mixing engineer was using something in his bus, in his stereo bus, then even more so. But even if he wasn't, you have a different mixing bus, right? The sum of these 4 parts will not sound exactly the same as what the mixing engineer did, right? So it's like starting with a mix that nobody really did, right? So, that bass sound, what you're setting up your bass sound, and it's, the bass added up with everything, and you love that bass, and now you solo it and you only have that bass, and now I'm adding it in a different workstation with a different mixing bus, and it's not the same bass. Nobody decided how that bass was going to be, right? Sometimes it works, sometimes it's awesome, but whenever you have a really good professional mix, chances are I'll prefer the stereo file. That said, I've been proven wrong many times, right? So the client, just let's try it out, and I say, oh, the stereo mix is awesome, I'm not going to use the stems, and I throw in the stems and start playing with it, and we go like, oh yeah, this is cool, let's use this, right? So
awesome. But as a general, if I am making my song, and I don't really know if you need the stems or not, because to be honest, even though we do notice the difference of things, maybe I'm not as a music producer or a songwriter, I don't have the ears to identify if you need my stems to make a proper master. Sometimes the mixing engineer that mixed my song is not from Musiversal, so we can't guarantee that the quality is going to be the same as a Musiversal engineer, even though there are great mixing engineers outside of Musiversal. How do I know if you need my stems or if just a stereo file is good?
So let's separate two things here, right? One thing is you have different ways of approaching the master, right? And you'll get a different result if you're using stems or if you're using stereo. And this has nothing to do with how good the mix is, right? This is something that can really only be defined once we are hands-on here, right? And I try to master starting from the stereo file, try to master starting from the stems, and that's where you will really make a decision as to what will bring me the best final result, right? And my experience is that in most cases, the stereo gives the best result, but that's not always true, right? A different thing is, okay, I have a mix here that for some reason, the mixing engineer, the producer, are not 100% sure about that mix, right? So that, again, doesn't necessarily have to be because the mix was not good, right? It's because you're not sure how that's going to behave in the mastering room. You're not sure about the decisions you made. So you finish your mix, but you're still thinking, is this bass too loud? Is my voice too low? Right? And so if you still want to leave those options open up to the last minute, right, then the stem mastering is an option, right? But again, of course, there is a situation where, people that are mixing have very little experience, and you can kind of save the day because you have the stems, because you have more resources. And I'm not going to lie and say that never happened, right? But it's the fact that, this flexibility is not necessarily just about, dealing with material that's not good, right? It's also about revisiting decisions that you're not necessarily sure about while you're mixing, either because you're inexperienced or just because, you want to keep an open mind on things, right?
That makes a lot of sense. Well, with that said, I think we covered a lot of the technical part, and we're already 40 minutes in our live stream, which is crazy because time flies. And I do want to hear a couple of things, but we didn't go over average levels. Do you want to talk a little bit about that before we go to the actual mastering process?
I'm going to get some water here. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Sure, let's do that. So let's turn audio movers on and I'll share my screen here again. Right?
That's great. So to everyone that wants to listen directly in audio movers with better streaming quality, better audio quality, then you can just use the link that I'm pasting in the chat here on YouTube. And the password for that is Musiversal. You can just type that in. I, of course, typed that on the chat as well. If you go to Audio Movers, you should mute this live stream. Of course, you're not going to hear me. You're only going to hear Luiz and whatever is playing there. But that being said, Luiz is doing most of the talking, and you should definitely listen to what's being played. So while Luiz is playing the song, you just mute this live stream, and while Luiz is speaking, you just come back here and unmute, and you're going to be able to listen to him. Sounds good? Luiz, remember that you have to mute me on your computer, otherwise you're going to be listening to this twice.
Sure. So we're talking about levels going into the levels I get in the mastering room. Is that what we're talking about, or did I just go nuts when I went get some water here?
Yeah, so we can talk about it. We were going to go over average loudness before we go and listen.
Exactly. So before I even play, I'm going to show you some waveforms here, right? So this is all material that has been normalized to minus 14 levels. You don't have to know what that means, but that means that in theory, they are all at the same level, right? So, but if you look at this waveform over here, right, you can see that it pretty much looks like a sausage, right? While if you look at this waveform, you can see that there are a lot of dynamics here, right? So it's this idea that if you're sending stuff to the mastering room, you don't want to have so much compression that in the mastering room, you don't have any room to compress it further, right? So your final waveform, when you're sending stuff to be mastered, it should look like something like this, right? It should not look like this, right? Like a straight line, right? And part of that has to do, we were talking about the overall levels, right? Even the same principle that applies after the mastering and applies before the mastering, right? So if you listen to the snare drum, for example, right? Is that, of course, I'm comparing completely different things, but the Red Hot Chili Peppers here, as much as I love this, I'm not saying they didn't do a job, far from that, but they gave up on that snare sound in order to be really, really, really loud, right? And once I normalize the volume, it's not sounding that loud anymore, right? But it's this idea that you can look at the waveform and say, like, where's the snare sound here, right? You can't even see the snare, right? So yeah, the music should be, so it's not really about levels. It's about how much compression do you have on your track, right? And it's about you deciding, how much compression do you want, but always comparing the before and after at the same volume. Because if you just have, a limiter, some limiter that when you lower the threshold, it automatically is raising the gain, you're going to go like, cool, it's louder, cool, it's louder, cool, it's louder. And before you know it, you're compressing a lot more than you needed to because it sounded better because it was louder, right? So if you're whenever you're gonna decide how much compression, how much average compression you're gonna use, you should always do that comparing the before and after at the same volume.
Yes, that's awesome. And it makes a lot of sense. Can you hear me now?
I can't
Awesome.
hear you, Bill.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And
Yes, I
it
can.
really makes, I think it's very clear what the difference is, and not necessarily something that is more compressed means is going to be louder. After all, we're all, the listener is in control of the volume knob. So if you want it to be louder, if you want just to be louder, the listener can always turn down what he's listening to, and then it wouldn't make a difference, right?
Yeah, it's not even a matter of the listener will turn it up and
Exactly.
down. The streaming platform will do that for you, right? So again, that wasn't the focus of what I was showing here, but people might have noticed the Madeleine Perrault sounded louder than Red Hot Chili Peppers, right? Because it was less compressed, right? But they were officially both at minus 14 loves, right? It wasn't the Madeleine Perrault that I played you. It was, this was,
I can't remember the name either.
I'm not going to remember this name. The guy from Doobie Brothers.
Yeah, I can't remember the name.
Yeah, this is something that is really interesting.
I won't get that name, but whatever.
That to visual art as well. If you want a painting to look really dark, you need to have some light spots in it, because it's not about how dark the paint you're using is about the difference between light and dark, the dynamic, the contrast that you see there. And it's pretty much the same in music, right? If you want something, for example, I want a guitar solo to be really, really loud. Well, I need quiet parts in that song, or something that is very quiet that I can compare it to. Because if everything is very loud, then nothing is too loud. And if there is something that I can compare with it, I think this is where dynamics come from, right? It's if I have something to compare and I can see that dynamic change, then something is going to feel really loud. Does that make sense?
Yes, but in this case, there's something further than that. There's something more than that. Which is, if you, this is what a snare looks like.
You
right?
need to share your
This
screen
is
again.
the waveform of the sound of a snare, right? If you compress it, oh, I'm sorry. So this is what
Still not seeing your screen, sorry.
the waveform of a snare looks like, right? If I'm compressing this, here you go.
Yes, now I see it.
There you go. There it is. So there's a distance in the vertical axis here, right? With this peak over here, that's what is translating to the snap of that snare, right? This is the sound of the snare and the waveform are the same thing. They're two representations of the same thing, right? Once you make this waveform, once you have a wave like this, and you're trying to find the snare here, well, this snare here doesn't really, where is the snare? I can't even find it over here, right? Certainly don't see anything that looks like that other waveform that we saw. Is this the snare? This might be the snare. Where's the attack, right? So you can't expect the snare on this song to sound like the snare on this song. It's never going to happen.
Different sound. Yes, a lot, actually.
Does that make sense? Right. Once you squash it, it's a different sound, right? I'm not even saying it's better or worse. It's different, and it's certainly further away from what
Definitely.
you had originally when the guy played the snare.
We have someone
Right.
with...
So it's not just about contrast. It's also about changing the shape of the sound in an important way.
We have someone with better memory than we do here. Brian actually said that song that you played before was by Michael McDonald. Is that right? Yes. So thank you, Brian, for reminding us. Your memory worked much better.
Exactly.
Way better than ours. So moving on, let's. We have about 10 minutes left. I guess we can still hear a couple of more things. Can we do have a song that we have mastered this week for this live stream specifically, and you can show us the difference a little bit between what a master song is and what a mixed song is. Can we go over that right now? We have very short time left, but I think that would be awesome.
Sure. Let's do that. So visually, you're seeing the same thing here, right? Because the one to the left is the mastered version. The one to the right is the version before it was mastered. But you're seeing it going through my toys in real time.
Right. So the mastered
there's no
version
difference
has plugins in it.
Waveform.
That's why it's
here.
mastered, but it's not like a printed version. It's not a printed audio file.
Exactly.
But if you were to put the printed audio file, it would look very different.
Through all my toys in real time. It would look pretty different. So I can even do this here.
Se os lugares que eu for você não quiser ir comigo, entendo. Só quero passar mais tempo com você. Vamos dançar sem nos preocupar, antes que a vida venha nos lembrar que amanhã já é segunda. Se os lugares que eu for você não quiser ir comigo, entendo. Só quero passar mais tempo com você. Vamos dançar sem nos preocupar, antes que a vida venha nos lembrar que amanhã. Se lugares que eu.
And depending on how you're monitoring this, if you're listening to this through your laptop speakers, there's a good chance you won't be able to notice that much of a difference, right? This is one of those masters where this is Enrique's mix, and Enrique sends stuff like that is really
here at Musiversal.
Almost ready, right? But still, you can notice, for example, that the percussiveness, the groove of the song is a lot livelier in the mastering version, right? So it's not just about balance, making it work everywhere. So it's really about the emotion, right? So I'm going to play this again for you, but hopefully you'll be able to tell that the mastered version is slamming more, and the mixed version kind of sounds laid back in comparison, right?
Se os lugares que eu for você não quiser ir comigo, entendo. Só quero passar mais tempo com. Se os lugares que eu for você não quiser ir comigo, entendo. Só quero passar mais tempo com você.
Pretty much buried in the mixed version, and they come out a lot more in the mastered version, right? Despite them being relatively similar, and this being a job where I did not change a lot of stuff, in reality, I did a bunch of stuff to this thing. So I have a transient shaper here, which is part of what's bringing up that percussion, right? I have this guy that's transforming my signal into an MS signal, a mid-side signal, right? After that, I have an EQ, which is actually a dynamic EQ that is helping me hold back some of that kick drum so that I can still have the snap of the kick drum, but the kick drum won't trigger as much the limiter at the end, right? If you look close by, the waveforms that tend to be louder, bigger in the vertical axis are the lower frequencies, right? So this guy is a dynamic EQ here is helping me tame that kick drum. And then I have a separate limiter here that is also working in MS, which is holding just the center, and it's not changing anything that's in the sides. That is important because it's also making that limiter at the end work a lot less, right? Here I make my signal back into a stereo signal, right? And then I have a few other toys that are dealing much more with texture, right? So this is a Neve emulation, for example, but I can turn on and off the Nevo here. I can turn on and off the clipping and the noise. So this doesn't really sound like a Neve 1084 anymore, which is what this guy's emulating, because I turned off the noise, I turned off the clipping. These are all things, it's almost as if I could rip apart, have a cleaner signal here than could actually be possible if I had the real thing, right? There's only so much you can do in a 1084 to know the noise floor. Here, you can just press a button and, the noise is gone, right? Okay, I can hear you again.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And my question for you now is, when you get the mix for the first time and you listen to it for the first time, you're going to start working on the master. What is the first thing that you look for? And what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Like, are you looking at the waveform? Are you listening to the track? Because are you identifying things? How your mastering process starts?
Yeah, good question. I'm not looking much. Of course, it's unavoidable that you're staring at the waveform, right? So if, for example, you send me a waveform that looks like this, right? I'm going to be immediately like, oh my God, what's going on here, right? The same way, if you send me a waveform that looks like this, I'm immediately going to go, oh my God, what's going on here, right? But within reason, I'm not really concerned about the waveform at all, right? It really, really is about hitting play and asking yourself, what is this music begging for, right? There's a part of it that's also, okay, I got to pay attention to the low end to make it work everywhere, right? Or the high end or whatever, right? But it's really, really about, in the case of this song, there's a percussive groove over here, right? And there are all these details. I want that with more energy, right? So I immediately thought, this thing there's a swing going on here. I want to reinforce that swing, that rhythmic, that bounciness, into the song, right? So it really is about understanding what the music is all about emotionally and what's emotion you're going to try to you want to transpire there, and that's the starting point, right? It's not if it's no, there's a little bit too much 400 hertz here. I can see in the spectrum analyzer, so I'm going to lower 400 hertz because I saw in the spectrum analyzer that there's too much 400 hertz. Sometimes that 400 hertz is because of that awesome cello that has a lot of 400 hertz. I'm going to take that 400 hertz and it's going to kill the cello. Right, so forget the visuals. Right, it's about hitting play and what is this music going for, and then no two songs will be alike in that sense, and they will take you in different directions. Right.
That makes a lot of sense. Sounds perfect. Well, we are coming up on our time, so I'm gonna give one last chance to everyone that is watching us, and I do know that there's a couple people still watching us. If you have any questions, if you have anything that you would like to know from a seasoned professional like Luiz, this is the time to ask a question. And before we go, I just want to say thank you, Luiz, for your time. It was very, very valuable to everyone here. I saw a lot of people commenting that this is great advice. That's what Don just said. Brian just thanked you for your time. This was beautiful. We also had Doozy saying hello from Nigeria. So we have a lot of people watching us today and thanking you for your time, and I'm also thanking you for your time. Before we go, any final thoughts, messages, things that you would like to mention to our dear guests?
No, thank you. And I hope this was somehow useful for you guys. And it's all about the music. It's all about the music.
On that note, I don't think I can finish better than that. It's all about music. So thank you everyone for joining. This webinar is going to be available for you guys to watch it later if you want to rewatch it. And if you have any questions, you are now able to book a session with Luiz here at Musiversal, a mastering advice session or a mixing advice session. I highly recommend you to do so because you're going to learn a lot in that session. We see you in the next webinar, which should be soon, and we have very, very exciting news and very, very exciting content planned ahead. So thank you so much for joining, and have a great night.